What if I told you that the men you were taught to worship in fifth grade social studies class were lying to you? Not metaphorically, not philosophically, actually, demonstrably, provably lying. The guys on your money, the guys with the statues, the guys your elementary school teachers described as brilliant visionaries who basically invented freedom from scratch, those guys. A surprising number of the things you believe about them are either completely fabricated, wildly exaggerated, or carefully constructed myths that somebody decided you needed to believe more than you needed the truth. You probably think George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and couldn't bring himself to lie about it. You probably think Thomas Jefferson was a passionate defender of liberty who genuinely believed all men were created equal. You probably think Benjamin Franklin was a lovable, kite-flying grandfather figure who just really cared about electricity and bifocals. You probably think the Founding Fathers were a unified band of noble geniuses who set aside their differences, fought off the British, and built the greatest democracy the world had ever seen out of pure patriotic devotion. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Almost every one of those stories has a problem. Some of them are outright inventions. Some are half-truths that got polished into legends because the full truth was messy and complicated and didn't look great on a motivational poster. Some were deliberately created by the men themselves, because yes, the Founding Fathers were deeply concerned with how history would remember them, and they were not above a little personal reputation management. And some of these myths were manufactured generations later by people who needed heroes more than they needed facts. This isn't a takedown. This isn't a cynical attempt to ruin everything you ever loved about American history. These men were genuinely remarkable in many ways. What they built was genuinely unprecedented. But remarkable people are still people, which means they were petty, contradictory, self-interested, terrified of failure, occasionally dishonest, and very, very human. And the gap between the marble statues we made of them and the actual flesh and blood men underneath is where the most interesting history lives. So before we dive in, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. Algorithms are weird and fickle, and the only way history content like this actually reaches people is if you help it get there. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, because we're about to spend a significant amount of time together dismantling a mythology that has been carefully constructed over 2.5 centuries. 100 lies. 100 corrections, some of them will surprise you. Some will make you genuinely angry. A few might actually make you respect these men more once you understand the real story rather than the sanitized version. Because here's the thing about myths. They flatten people. They take a complicated, brilliant, flawed, fascinating human being and they sand off every rough edge until what's left is a symbol. And symbols can't teach you anything, but people can. The cherry tree never happened. It was invented by a preacher trying to sell books. Washington's wooden teeth weren't wood. Jefferson didn't write the Declaration of Independence alone, and he definitely didn't believe the words he wrote applied to everyone. Franklin was far stranger and far more interesting than the friendly old man on the $100 bill. Hamilton was not the scrappy immigrant hero the musical convinced you he was, at least not without significant asterisks. Adams was not the forgotten footnote history made him out to be. And Paul Revere's Midnight Ride was not what you think it was. Not even close. We're going to cover all of it. Myths about their personal lives. Myths about their beliefs. Myths about the revolution itself. Myths about the Constitution and what they actually intended when they wrote it. Myths about slavery, about religion, about their relationships with each other, about the famous moments that got turned into paintings and songs and national holidays. We're going to look at what the historical record actually says versus what the legend says, and in almost every case, the actual truth is more interesting than the version you were taught. Some of these corrections come from documents the Founding Fathers wrote themselves, letters, diaries, private correspondence they never expected the public to read. Some come from the people who knew them personally and kept their own records. Some come from historians who have spent decades in archives pulling apart the stories we tell ourselves about where we came from. And some are so obvious, so easy to verify, that it's genuinely strange we're all still walking around believing the myth. So here's what we're going to do. 100 items. 100 moments where the legend and the reality went different directions. By the time we're done, you won't think less of the Founding Fathers. You'll think more clearly about them, And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why knowing the truth about where you came from matters a whole lot more than believing a comfortable story somebody made up to sell you an idea about your country. Let's start at the very beginning. 1. The Cherry Tree Confession. George Washington never chopped down a cherry tree and then delivered a tearful confession about it to his father. That story is completely made up. It was invented by a man named Mason Locke Weems, a traveling bookseller and preacher who wrote a biography of Washington just a few years after Washington died. Weems needed the book to sell, and a story about a dead president being a decent politician wasn't exactly going to fly off the shelves. So he invented a parable about young George, a hatchet, a cherry tree, and a boy so constitutionally incapable of dishonesty that he confessed on the spot. Weems literally admitted the story came from a source he couldn't name. That source was his own imagination. The most famous lie about the Founding Fathers is a story invented to prove one of them couldn't lie. 2. The Founders as a unified group. We talk about the Founding Fathers like they were a team, a group of like-minded geniuses who sat around nodding at each other and agreeing that freedom was good. The reality is that they could barely stand each other. Hamilton and Jefferson despised one another so completely that their feud shaped American politics for generations. Adams and Hamilton were enemies within the same political party. Jefferson and Adams stopped speaking for over a decade. Washington spent much of his presidency exhausted by the fact that his own cabinet was at war with itself. They disagreed about the power of the federal government, about whether banks should exist, about how to handle France, about what the Constitution even meant. The image of the Founding Fathers as a unified brotherhood of patriots is a myth. They were a group of ambitious, brilliant, frequently furious men who agreed on very little once the revolution was over. 3. The Founders wanted pure democracy. Here is something your civics class probably glossed over. The Founding Fathers were genuinely afraid of democracy. Not opposed to freedom, but deeply suspicious of what happened when you handed direct power to large groups of people without any filters in place. James Madison wrote extensively about the dangers of what he called factions, the tendency of popular majorities to trample minority rights in moments of passion. Alexander Hamilton thought pure democracy was essentially mob rule with better branding. The entire structure of the Constitution, the Electoral College, the Senate, the appointed judiciary, was deliberately designed to put distance between the raw will of the public and the actual levers of government. They built a republic, not a democracy, and they did it on purpose. When someone quotes the founders to argue for pure majority rule, they are arguing against exactly what the founders believed. 4. The Constitution created universal freedom. The Constitution is a remarkable document. It is also a document that, when it was written and ratified, explicitly protected the institution of slavery, counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of congressional representation, and excluded women, non-property owners, and virtually everyone who wasn't a white male landowner from meaningful political participation. The word freedom appears in it. The reality of who that freedom covered was a much smaller circle than the soaring language implied. The men who wrote about liberty and natural rights did so while constructing a legal framework that preserved the economic interests of the wealthy and the slaveholding. The Constitution was a compromise document, which means it required enormous numbers of people to be left out of the deal so that the people in the room could reach an agreement and go home. 5. All founders opposed slavery. Some founding fathers were genuinely opposed to slavery and said so clearly and publicly. Most were not, and several of the most famous ones built their entire lives on it. Washington enslaved over 300 people. Jefferson enslaved over 600 across his lifetime. James Madison enslaved people. Patrick Henry, the man who famously declared "Give me liberty" or "Give me death," enslaved people and acknowledged the hypocrisy with a shrug and continued doing it anyway. The story that the founders universally recognized slavery as evil and intended to phase it out is a comfortable revision. The men who could have done something about it at the Constitutional Convention largely chose not to, because doing so would have blown up the entire project. They made a calculation. The Union mattered more than the people they were leaving in chains. 6. Jefferson planned to free the enslaved people he owned. Thomas Jefferson wrote that slavery was a moral and political depravity. He called it a wolf by the ears, meaning he felt trapped, unable to let go, and unable to hold on comfortably. What he actually did about it was almost nothing. Jefferson freed 2 enslaved people during his lifetime. 2 out of hundreds. He freed 5 more in his will, most of them members of the Hemmings family, which historians now widely acknowledge included his own children. The rest, over 100 enslaved people, were sold after his death to pay his debts. Jefferson's private writings show a man who understood exactly what slavery was and found elaborate philosophical reasons to keep doing it anyway. The gap between what Jefferson wrote and what Jefferson did is one of the most significant gaps in all of American history. 7. Washington didn't own enslaved people. George Washington is often discussed in softer terms than Jefferson on the question of slavery, partly because he did eventually choose to free the enslaved people he personally owned in his will. But let's be clear about what his life actually looked like. Washington controlled more than 300 enslaved people at Mount Vernon. Some he owned outright. Others were the legal property of his wife Martha's estate, which meant he had no legal authority to free them even if he'd wanted to. He pursued enslaved people who escaped, including a woman named Ona Judge, who fled to New Hampshire and whom Washington repeatedly tried to have captured and returned. The version of Washington as a reluctant slaveholder quietly troubled by the institution doesn't survive much contact with the actual historical record of what he did. 8. Benjamin Franklin always hated slavery. Benjamin Franklin is often held up as the most enlightened of the founders, the wise old man of the Revolution, the one who figured everything out. So here is an uncomfortable fact that tends to get left out of that portrait. Franklin owned enslaved people. He kept enslaved servants in his household for years. He ran advertisements in his Pennsylvania Gazette to help other people buy and sell enslaved human beings. The late-life abolitionist version of Franklin, the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society who submitted anti-slavery petitions to Congress, is real. But he arrived at that position after decades of participating in the institution he later condemned. Franklin was in his 80s when he became a vocal abolitionist. He had plenty of years before that to take a different position and didn't. Moral growth is real and worth acknowledging. So is the timeline of when that growth actually happened and what it cost him to wait. 9. John Adams owned slaves. When we talk about the founders and slavery, John Adams is almost never part of the conversation. There's a reason for that, and it's actually one of the more straightforward facts in this entire discussion. Adams never owned enslaved people, not once. He found the institution morally repugnant and said so repeatedly in letters and public statements throughout his life. He refused to use enslaved labor even when it would have been economically convenient. His wife Abigail shared his views and expressed them even more forcefully. This doesn't make Adams a saint or erase the many legitimate criticisms of his presidency, including the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were a genuine assault on civil liberties. But the lie here runs in an interesting direction. We've flattened the founders into a single mass of identical hypocrites, and in doing so we've erased the ones who actually tried to live by the principles they preached. 10. The founders were all Christians in the same way. Ask most people what the founding fathers believed about religion, and you'll get one of 2 equally wrong answers. Either they were all devout Christians who built a Christian nation, or they were all secular atheists who wanted God completely out of government. The actual picture is messier and far more interesting. Washington spoke frequently about providence, but rarely about Jesus, and avoided communion throughout his adult life. Jefferson cut the miracles out of his Bible with a literal razor blade and kept only the moral teachings. He called himself a Christian in the way that someone might call themselves a fan of a band after removing every song they don't like. Franklin expressed open skepticism about the divinity of Christ. Paine called organized religion a human invention designed to control populations. Hamilton was largely indifferent to faith until facing death. They were a group of men with complicated, private, frequently unorthodox beliefs that don't fit neatly onto anyone's bumper sticker. 11. Thomas Paine was a founder in government. Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, the pamphlet that arguably did more than any other single document to push ordinary colonists toward supporting independence. Washington had it read aloud to his troops. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies in a country of only 2.5 million people. Paine's words are woven into the fabric of how Americans understand the Revolution, and yet Paine never held a major constitutional office. He never signed the Constitution. He wasn't in the room where the key decisions were made. He was a propagandist in the best possible sense, a man who could translate revolutionary ideas into language that working people could feel in their chests. But when the new government was being built, Paine was largely on the outside. He spent years in France, was imprisoned there, nearly executed, and returned to America in 1802 to find himself largely unwelcome. The man who helped start the revolution died poor and nearly forgotten. 12. The Declaration ended British rule immediately. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. Britain formally recognized American independence in 1783. That's 7 years of war between the moment the founders put their names on a document and the moment that document actually meant something on the international stage. The Declaration didn't end British rule. It announced an intention to end British rule, which is a very different thing. What followed was years of brutal fighting, military defeats, a brutal winter at Valley Forge that nearly destroyed the Continental Army, and a war that only turned in America's favor significantly because France decided humiliating Britain was worth the investment. The founders didn't declare independence and watch the redcoats sail home. They declared independence and then spent the better part of a decade trying to survive long enough to make it stick. The gap between the words and the reality is where most of the actual history lives. 13. The revolution was fought by all colonists. The popular image of the American Revolution is a unified people rising up against a tyrannical empire. The actual population of the colonies was deeply, sometimes violently divided. Historians estimate that roughly a third of colonists were patriots who actively supported independence, a third were loyalists who opposed it, and a third were somewhere in the middle, trying to survive regardless of who won. Tens of thousands of loyalists fought for the British. Hundreds of thousands fled to Canada and Britain during and after the war rather than live under the new government. Many enslaved people sided with the British because the British, whatever their other motives, were offering freedom in exchange for service. Indigenous nations made strategic choices based on their own interests, which usually meant opposing the expansion the Patriots represented. The Revolution was a civil war as much as a colonial independence movement, and the side that won got to write the version that erased all of that. 14. The Boston Tea Party was about a tea tax hike. Everyone knows the story. Angry colonists dumped British tea into Boston Harbor to protest oppressive taxation. Taxation without representation. The slogan writes itself. Here's the part that gets left out almost every time. The Tea Act of 1773 actually lowered the price of tea for American colonists. The East India Company was drowning in surplus tea, and the British government gave it the right to sell directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen and dropping the price significantly. The colonists who dumped that tea into the harbor were not protesting a tax hike. Many of them were merchants and smugglers who were furious that cheaper legal tea was going to undercut their business. The principle of taxation without representation was real and genuinely important. But the Boston Tea Party was also significantly about protecting the profit margins of men who had a financial stake in keeping British tea expensive. Follow the money, even in 1773. 15. No taxation without representation meant everyone wanted voting rights. Taxation without representation sounds like a universal democratic awakening, as if every cobbler and farmhand suddenly demanded a ballot. The reality was narrower and more comfortable for the men in charge. Most patriots still believed that only certain people should have a say in government, and certain people usually meant property-owning white men. Many states kept or even tightened property requirements for voting and office holding after independence. Poor whites, women, free black people, indigenous people, and of course enslaved people were not suddenly invited into the political process. The slogan was about which elite got taxed and who got to sit in the legislature, not about a radical expansion of democracy. The founders talked endlessly about liberty, but most of them had a very specific image of who counted as the people, and it didn't include everyone paying duties on imported goods. 16. The founders invented religious freedom from nothing. We like to imagine the founders as lone geniuses who woke up one morning and decided, out of nowhere, that religious freedom was a good idea, as if they stared at a blank sheet of parchment and conjured the First Amendment by sheer moral force. In truth, they were drawing on decades of colonial experiments and centuries of European arguments. Rhode Island's charter under Roger Williams had already promised broad toleration. Pennsylvania under William Penn had functioned as a practical test case for pluralism. Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke had written treatises arguing that faith could not be sincere if coerced. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, often credited to Jefferson, moved through politics thanks largely to James Madison's organizing and a long local fight against established churches. The founders didn't invent religious liberty in a vacuum. They assembled existing pieces, tested in smaller settings, and wrote them into national law. 17. The founders wrote the Constitution quickly and easily. The Constitution is often treated as if it were handed down fully formed, the product of a few brilliant minds in perfect agreement, working at superhuman speed. In reality, the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was messy, slow, and frequently on the verge of collapse. Delegates argued bitterly over representation, slavery, the presidency, and how much power the federal government should have. They met in secret, with windows closed in the Philadelphia heat, precisely because they knew the public might panic at the extent of the changes they were considering. Big states threatened to walk out. Small states threatened to walk out. Several delegates actually did leave in disgust. Major provisions, like the structure of Congress and the Electoral College, were last-minute compromises or committee inventions, not long-held principles. The finished document was less a masterpiece written in a flash, and more a patched-together truce that barely held the coalition together. 18. The Constitution was signed by everyone important in school. The picture is simple. Every important founder gathers in one room, nods solemnly, and signs the Constitution. But some of the names you instinctively associate with American founding weren't even there. Thomas Jefferson was in France as minister to the French court, writing letters from Paris and learning about European politics. John Adams was in Britain as the American minister, trying to negotiate with the very empire they had just broken away from. Both men later weighed in on the document, praising parts and criticizing others, but they were not in Philadelphia debating clauses line by line. Other prominent revolutionaries were serving in state governments, abroad on diplomatic missions, or simply uninvolved. Founder is a broad label we retroactively apply. The actual group of men who wrote and signed the Constitution was smaller and more specific than the myth suggests, and it did not include every famous name. 19. All delegates signed the Constitution. The image of the Constitution's signing day is one of unity, every delegate stepping forward to endorse the new framework they'd spent months building. The record tells a different story. 55 men attended the convention at some point. Only 39 signed. Some, like George Mason and Elbridge Gerry, refused to sign because they felt the document lacked a Bill of Rights or gave too much power to the central government. Others had gone home early, frustrated or sick, and never returned. A few states saw their delegations fracture, with some members signing while colleagues refused. The fact that so many leading figures balked at the final product is precisely why the Bill of Rights became politically necessary to secure ratification. The Constitution did not emerge with unanimous backing even inside that locked chamber. It was controversial from day one, and dissent was built into its birth certificate. 20. The founders expected political parties to work smoothly. We tend to tell the story of early American politics as if the founders calmly created parties like they were designing efficient machines for organizing debate. The truth is they mostly feared parties and factions and then stumbled into building them anyway. Reading their letters, you find constant anxiety that factions would place selfish interests above the common good and tear the republic apart. Madison famously wrote about the danger of factions in the Federalist Papers. Yet within a few years, Madison himself helped organize the Democratic-Republican opposition to Alexander Hamilton's Federalist program. Hamilton, in turn, built his own faction around a strong national government and commercial interests. Newspapers became openly partisan attack dogs. Elections grew vicious almost immediately. The founders didn't calmly plan a two-party system and expect it to run smoothly. They warned against exactly what they then created under pressure of real disagreements and personal rivalries. 21. George Washington loved political parties. Because Washington's presidency ended up straddling the birth of party politics, it's easy to assume he was comfortable with the whole thing, maybe even quietly aligned with one side. He wasn't. Washington spent much of his second term watching his cabinet split into open warfare between Jefferson's supporters and Hamilton's supporters, and he hated it. He saw the emerging parties as threats to national unity and independence of judgment. In his farewell address, he warned that parties could become tools for foreign influence, encourage revenge politics, and make ordinary disagreements existential crises. He urged Americans to prioritize the Union over factional loyalty. Despite this, later politicians and parties eagerly claimed his image, wrapping themselves in his legacy while doing exactly what he feared. The man we remember as the first national unifier spent his last years in office watching parties form and grow, in ways he found alarming, not exciting. 22. Washington's farewell address was his spoken speech. We call it a farewell address. So your brain probably imagines Washington standing in a crowded hall, giving one last majestic speech, everyone weeping quietly in powdered wigs. That never happened. Washington's farewell was a written document, drafted with heavy help from Alexander Hamilton, polished and repolished, then sent to a Philadelphia newspaper in 1796. It was meant to be read, reprinted, and passed around, not delivered from a podium. Citizens encountered it in print, line by line, not as a live performance. The image of Washington thundering these warnings aloud is a later fantasy, not an event that actually took place. 23. George Washington had wooden teeth. The wooden teeth story is one of those lies that sounds charmingly rustic, like Washington was half soldier, half tree. The truth is more disturbing. His surviving dentures were made of ivory from hippopotamus and elephant, bits of metal, and, in some cases, human teeth purchased from poor people and probably taken from enslaved people he owned. Contemporary records show him buying teeth from Negroes, likely his own enslaved workers, for use in dental work. The dentures were uncomfortable, painful, and had to be constantly adjusted. Wood never shows up in the actual materials. What we turned into a folksy myth was really a story about pain, wealth, and exploitation. 24. Washington always wanted to be president. In hindsight, it's easy to think Washington spent the revolution rehearsing for the presidency, craving the top job like a modern politician. His letters tell a different story. Constant complaints about being dragged from his beloved Mount Vernon, fear that his reputation would be ruined by failure, and a deep desire to retire quietly. He accepted the presidency because he believed refusing might destabilize the fragile new government, and because everyone around him insisted he was indispensable. He tried to quit after one term, was talked into a second, and then fought off pressure to stay longer. The man we remember as eager first president mostly wanted to be an aging farmer, left alone. 25. Washington never lost a battle. The heroic version of George Washington suggests an unbroken string of victories, a commander who outsmarted the British every time. In reality, his early military record includes some spectacular failures. He lost New York City in 1776, suffering defeats at Long Island, Kips Bay, and White Plains. He was beaten at Brandywine and Germantown in 1777. His troops froze and starved because supply and planning often fell apart. What made Washington effective wasn't a perfect win-loss record, but his refusal to let defeat end the war. He learned from mistakes, avoided total destruction, kept an army in the field, and turned a series of tactical losses into a long-term strategic victory. 26. Washington won independence alone. American myth likes a lone hero story. Washington against the British Empire, with a couple of scrappy militias and pure determination. The ledger of the war says something else. French money paid for supplies and equipment. French officers, like Lafayette and Rochambeau, advised and commanded troops. Most crucially, the French Navy blocked British relief at Yorktown, trapping Cornwallis's army and making surrender unavoidable. Spanish and Dutch support strained British resources in other theaters. Without French loans, French soldiers, and French ships, the revolution likely collapses or drags on into stalemate. Washington was important, but independence was an international project, not a one-man show. 27. The Delaware crossing was a solo masterstroke. You've seen the painting. Washington standing heroically in a boat, ice flows all around, a single brilliant gamble that saved the revolution. The real operation was less clean and more chaotic. Washington planned a coordinated attack with multiple crossings of the Delaware on Christmas night 1776, aiming to hit Hessian forces in New Jersey from several directions. Only his main force made it across in time. Other columns were delayed or turned back because of ice and weather. The success at Trenton depended on Hessian fatigue, poor outposts, and sheer luck that the storm concealed his movements. It was daring and impressive, but not a lone flash of genius executed flawlessly. It was a risky plan that half failed and still worked. 28. Valley Forge was the coldest point of the war. Valley Forge has become shorthand for unimaginable winter suffering, as if it were the coldest, deadliest place the Continental Army ever camped. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge was miserable. Shortages of food, clothing, and shelter, disease ripping through weakened men, but temperature records suggest other winters were actually colder. More soldiers died of illness in other encampments too. What made Valley Forge legendary wasn't uniquely brutal weather, but what happened there: training under Baron von Steuben, new discipline, a reorganized army that emerged more professional. Later generations folded all the war's winter hardship into that single name and turned it into a symbol, exaggerating its cold while forgetting equally deadly places that didn't fit the story as neatly. 29. The Continental Army was a professional national force from the start. It's tempting to imagine the Continental Army springing into existence like a fully formed national military, uniforms crisp, enlistments long, supply lines humming. In 1775 and 1776, it was much closer to a barely glued together crowd. The army was a shifting patchwork of New England militias, short-term volunteers, and men whose enlistments expired right before major campaigns. Officers begged Congress for powder, shoes, and coats that never arrived on time. Some regiments had muskets but no bayonets. Others had bayonets but barely any training. Men went home when crops needed planting, or because their term was up, and Congress had no money for bounties. Washington spent as much energy fighting desertion, disease, and local jealousies as he did the British. The idea of a stable, professional Continental Army only really takes shape years into the war, after painful improvisation, reorganization, and repeated near collapse. 30. Militias won the revolution by themselves. The romantic story says local militias grabbed their muskets, sprang from their cabins, and single-handedly drove out the British Empire. Militias were crucial, but they were never the whole war. Local forces were effective at harassment, intelligence, and short, sharp engagements close to home, where men knew the terrain and could melt back into their communities. They were terrible at long campaigns, discipline under fire, and holding fixed positions over months. At battles like Long Island, Brandywine, or Monmouth, it was the Continental Army, not ad hoc militias, that absorbed the punishment and kept the war going. Militias often refused to serve outside their own colonies or for more than a few weeks. Without a central army to tie together strategy, take the worst hits, and give foreign allies a recognizable partner, the militia's scattered bravery would remain exactly that, scattered. The myth erases the grind that regular soldiers endured year after year. 31. The Minutemen were perfectly prepared citizen soldiers. Minutemen sounds like a superhero brand. Men ready to move in 60 seconds, all expertly drilled and flawlessly equipped. Reality is uneven and regional. Some towns in Massachusetts and Connecticut had highly organized companies with regular training days, community-funded arms, and carefully maintained powder stocks. Others had a handful of aging muskets, rusty bayonets, and minimal practice because local politics, poverty, or simple disinterest got in the way. The label Minutemen itself was partly motivational propaganda, a way to pressure communities into taking defense more seriously. Readiness depended on who your neighbors were, how wealthy your town was, and whether local leaders pushed training or shrugged it off. On any given alarm, some companies would form up fast and march in decent order, while others arrived late, poorly supplied, and unsure of commands. The polished image of universally elite Minutemen hides a messy range from genuinely formidable to barely functional. 32. Paul Revere shouted, "The British are coming." The textbook version has Paul Revere galloping through the night, yelling, "The British are coming," as doors fly open and sleepy farmers grab muskets. That line makes no sense in context. In April 1775, most colonists still considered themselves British subjects. Yelling "The British are coming" would be like standing in a modern suburb and shouting "Americans are coming" as if that narrowed things down. Revere's real task was more specific: warned that regular army troops were marching out of Boston toward Concord and possibly toward Patriot leaders. He likely used phrases like "the regulars are out," passed quiet messages directly to local captains, and relied on prearranged signals rather than noisy theatrics. Loudly announcing his presence on dark roads filled with royal patrols would have been suicidal, not heroic. The shouted catchphrase is a later invention, grafted onto a ride that depended on discretion, not volume. 33. Paul Revere rode alone. Turning Revere into a lone midnight rider makes the story cleaner, but it shrinks an entire network into one man. That night, multiple messengers rode out of Boston by different routes. William Dawes left by land before Revere, slipping past British guards at Boston Neck. Revere took a boat across the Charles River, then mounted a borrowed horse on the far side. Later, Samuel Prescott joined them, a local doctor who knew the countryside better than either. When a British patrol stopped the group, Revere was detained, Dawes was separated and lost his mount, and Prescott leapt a wall, escaped, and actually carried the warning onto Concord. Dozens of lesser-known riders fanned out to nearby villages from there. Revere's role was important, but he was one messenger in a relay, not a solitary hero racing through the darkness, while everyone else slept helplessly. 34. Only the midnight ride warned Concord. The midnight ride story suggests Concord's defense hinged entirely on a few men on fast horses. In reality, New England already had an alarm system built for exactly this kind of emergency. Towns maintained networks of church bells, drums, beacon fires, and prearranged messengers. When riders like Revere, Dawes, and Prescott delivered the first warnings, local committees of safety activated their own plans, passing word to neighboring towns in widening circles. Bells rang in the night, guns were fired as signals, and messengers on foot and horseback relayed information along familiar routes. Some communities heard hours before British troops arrived, enough time to move weapons, hide supplies, or decide whether to muster. Others got only minutes. The point is that the system didn't rely on a single heroic ride. It relied on dozens of local routines and redundancies. The midnight ride was the spark, but the countryside lit up because the tinder was already laid. 35. The shot heard round the world has a known shooter poems and paintings like certainty. They show a clear moment, a British officer ordering fire, or a brave colonial farmer defiantly shooting first. The reality of April 19, 1775 at Lexington and Concord is confusion. On the Lexington Green, dawn light, tense lines of militiamen and regulars, shouts, a command to disperse, and then a shot from somewhere, no one knew exactly where in the chaos. Both sides later blamed the other, each insisting the enemy fired first. At Concord's North Bridge, smoke, distance, and nervous troops made it just as murky. Eyewitness accounts conflict, memories were colored by later politics, and no neutral observer wrote down a tidy answer. The shot heard round the world is a poetic phrase added later, not a forensic conclusion. The first trigger pull that started open war between empire and colonies belongs to an unknown hand, lost in the noise and fear of a morning no one yet knew was historic. 36. The founders were all old men. If you picture the founding fathers, you probably see a room full of gray-haired grandfathers nodding wisely over parchment. In reality, the revolutionary generation skewed surprisingly young. Alexander Hamilton was still a teenager when he wrote fiery pamphlets, defending resistance to Britain, and barely in his 20s as Washington's aide. James Madison was 25 when the war began, and 36 at the Constitutional Convention. Aaron Burr was a battle-tested officer in his early 20s. Even Jefferson was only 33 when he drafted the Declaration, hardly an elder statesman. The leaders we remember as powdered, portrait-ready old men were, in the crucial years of revolt and founding, closer in age to modern grad students and startup founders than to retirement home residents. 37. Alexander Hamilton was an American native-born founder. It's easy to lump Hamilton in with the Virginia and Massachusetts crowd and assume he was just another colonial-born elite. He wasn't. Hamilton was born out of wedlock on the island of Nevis in the British Caribbean, then raised on St. Croix. His early life unfolded amid sugar plantations, slavery, hurricanes, and commercial shipping, not New England town meetings. He came to the mainland as a teenager, sponsored by local patrons impressed by his writing after a devastating storm. When he arrived in New York, he was very much an immigrant, foreign-born, lacking family networks, and sensitive to how fragile status could be. His fierce nationalism and obsession with building a strong central state partly grew out of that outsider experience. He knew what it meant to come from the margins of empire. 38. Hamilton came from wealth and ease. The Broadway version gives Hamilton a scrappy backstory, but people still sometimes imagine he must have had some family cushion. He didn't. He grew up in a collapsing household on a poor Caribbean island, the son of an unmarried couple. His father abandoned the family, his mother died when he was a child, and the small store she ran went bankrupt. Hamilton and his brother were left with almost nothing, briefly living with a cousin who then killed himself. As a teenager, Hamilton clerked at a trading house, working long hours tracking cargo accounts in ships, gaining the commercial knowledge that later shaped his financial policies. His way out wasn't inheritance or family connections, it was talent noticed by a few local elites. They took up a collection to send him to school in the colonies. He rose from precarity, not privilege. 39. Hamilton wrote the Constitution. Almost alone, Hamilton later wrote so much about the Constitution that it's tempting to imagine him as its lone mastermind, quill flying while everyone else napped. In Philadelphia in 1787, his role was important but limited. He made dramatic speeches calling for a powerful central government and even floated a plan that looked suspiciously like a quasi-monarchy, which scared many delegates. Then he left the convention for long stretches, missing much of the tedious but crucial line-by-line drafting. The heavy lifting of designing the framework, hammering out compromises, and refining language fell heavily on James Madison, along with Gouverneur Morris, James Wilson, and others. Hamilton became the Constitution's fiercest public defender through the Federalist Papers, but he did not silently write it in some back room while everyone else watched. The convention was a committee project, not a solo act. 40. Hamilton and Jefferson only argued about personality. It's comforting to explain their feud as clashing temperaments. Hamilton the ambitious city man, Jefferson the aloof country philosopher. The hatred ran deeper than personal style. They fought over what the United States should be. Hamilton pushed for a national bank, federal assumption of state debts, and close commercial ties with Britain, believing a strong financial backbone and centralized power were necessary to survive in a hostile world. Jefferson saw those plans as a betrayal of the Revolution, fearing a finance-driven aristocracy and corruption in cities and capital markets. He favored decentralized agriculture, state power, and sympathy with revolutionary France. They clashed over whether the Constitution allowed implied powers, how much executive authority was safe, and who America should align with abroad. Their rivalry wasn't just two inflated egos, it was an early, bitter version of the fights that still structure American politics. 41. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration entirely alone. School lessons often hand Jefferson the entire spotlight, as if he locked himself in a room and emerged with a finished document untouched by anyone else. In truth, the Continental Congress appointed a small committee to draft a declaration. Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Jefferson did write the initial draft, leaning on earlier state and local declarations and common revolutionary language about rights. But his colleagues commented, suggested changes, and edited. Franklin softened phrasing, Adams defended some key passages, and both nudged Jefferson on tone. Then the full Congress took the draft and went to work, cutting entire sections, including a long condemnation of the British role in the slave trade, and revising sentences. Jefferson's pen mattered immensely, but the final declaration was a group project shaped by committee review and congressional editing. 42. Jefferson wrote the Declaration on July 4. The date printed in big letters at the top of the Declaration makes it feel like Jefferson sat down on July 4th, wrote furiously, and handed over a final masterpiece just in time for signatures. The timeline is slower and messier. Congress appointed the drafting committee in early June 1776. Jefferson began writing shortly after, working on his draft in a rented room in Philadelphia, while Congress debated independence more broadly. He produced his version by late June, well before July. The document then went through committee tweaks and days of debate and revision on the floor of Congress. On July 2, Congress voted for independence. On July 4, they approved the final text of the Declaration. Printing started that night. Jefferson's writing happened in June. July 4 marks adoption, not the moment inspiration struck his pen. 43. July 4 was the real independence vote. The date burned into American memory is July 4, so it's natural to assume that's when Congress finally worked up the nerve to vote for independence. But the actual break with Britain was decided 2 days earlier, on July 2, 1776, when the Continental Congress approved Richard Henry Lee's resolution declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. That was the legal moment of separation. John Adams even predicted that July 2 would be celebrated with pomp and parade from this time forward forevermore. He was wrong only about the date that stuck in the public mind. July 4 is when Congress approved the wording of the Declaration, not when they voted to leave the empire. The fireworks commemorate the press release, not the decision. 44. Everyone signed the Declaration on July 4. The classic image is very tidy. July 4, a hot summer day, all the delegates lined up to dramatically sign the Declaration while history holds its breath. Reality was slower and much less theatrical. On July 4, Congress approved the text and ordered it printed. Nobody lined up that day with quills in hand. The printed broadsides, like the famous Dunlap broadside, went out first without a page of signatures. The engrossed, formal handwritten copy, the one you picture with John Hancock's grand flourish, was prepared afterward. Most delegates signed that document on August 2, nearly a month later. Some weren't present and added their names even later in the fall. A few men whose names appear on the Declaration weren't part of Congress on July 4 at all. The everyone signed on Independence Day story is patriotic stage direction, not chronology. 45. The Declaration's famous engrossed copy was the original working draft. When people imagine Jefferson's draft, they usually picture the elegant parchment with neat handwriting and big signatures, the version that ended up in the National Archives. That copy, the engrossed one, was a polished fair copy ordered after Congress had finished arguing over the text. The working drafts looked different. Jefferson's original manuscript, now only partly surviving, had his cramped handwriting, crossouts, and margin notes. Congress then edited his work on paper that never became a ceremonial artifact. Printers used a corrected text to create the first broadsides for the public, which circulated before the fancy parchment existed. Only later did Congress tell a professional clerk to write out a clean, formal version suitable for long-term preservation and for members to sign. The famous sheet is like the leather-bound edition of a book. The actual writing and editing happened on much messier pages. 46. John Hancock signed huge so King George could read it. You've probably heard the line that John Hancock wrote his name so large that King George can read it without his spectacles. It's a fun story, tailor-made for textbooks and 4th of July speeches. It's also, as far as the historical record goes, a later joke with no real evidence behind it. Hancock did sign prominently and stylishly. He was the president of Congress, after all, and his name went first. 18th century signatures varied in size and flourish. Bold penmanship didn't automatically equal symbolic defiance. The famous quip doesn't appear in contemporary diaries, letters, or official documents. It shows up later as part of the growing mythology around the Revolution, when storytellers wanted colorful anecdotes to match the drama of independence. Hancock risked his life by signing, but he didn't leave us a written note explaining font size as political theater. 47. The Liberty Bell rang on July 4, 1776. The story of the Liberty Bell tolling out across Philadelphia on July 4 as the Declaration was read is such a staple that it feels almost impolite to question it. But historians who go looking for contemporary evidence of that dramatic ringing find silence. The tale really took off in the 1840s, especially after a popular short story by George Lippard described an old bell ringer anxiously waiting for word of the vote on independence, then joyfully pulling the rope. It was sentimental fiction that quickly hardened into fact in public memory. The bell itself wasn't even called the Liberty Bell during the Revolution. That label came later from abolitionists. Bells did ring for various celebrations and announcements in Philadelphia, but the precise image of that bell, that day, marking that moment is built on literary invention, not solid documentation. 48. Betsy Ross made the first American flag. The Betsy Ross story is one of the most enduring revolutionary legends. George Washington himself supposedly visited her upholstery shop, handed her a sketch of a flag, and she suggested 5-pointed stars instead of 6. It's a charming scene. It's also supported mainly by family testimony given decades after her death. No contemporary document from the 1770s mentions Ross as the designer of the first national flag. Congress's 1777 flag resolution describes stars and stripes, but doesn't credit an individual maker. Many flag makers, seamstresses, and contractors were at work supplying banners to the Army and Navy. Ross almost certainly did make flags. She was a working upholsterer in Philadelphia, and receipts show she did government sewing, but whether she made the first official United States flag is unproven. The neat narrative of a single patriotic seamstress simplifies a murky, collaborative reality. 49. The Stars and Stripes was the only revolutionary flag. When you think of the American Revolution, you probably picture one uniform flag. 13 stars and 13 stripes flying over every battlefield and meeting hall. The reality was a chaotic sea of banners. Colonies, regiments, militias, and ships used their own designs. There was the Continental Grand Union flag with the British Union Jack still in the canton, flown early in the war. New England units carried pine tree flags. South Carolina had a crescent and palmetto. The rattlesnake don't tread on me designs, like the Gadsden flag, appeared on some naval and military standards. Even versions of the Stars and Stripes varied, with different arrangements and sometimes numbers of stars as states were added or symbolism shifted. A standardized national flag was more aspiration than reality during the conflict. The iconic Stars and Stripes eventually won out, but it shared the field with many rivals. 50. The founders created the bald eagle symbol without debate. It's easy to picture the founders instantly uniting around the majestic bald eagle, as if everyone just looked up, pointed, and said, "That one." The Great Seal actually went through years of committee work, redesigns, and argument. 3 separate committees tried and failed before Congress finally approved Charles Thompson's composite design in 1782, with the eagle, shield, arrows, and olive branch. This wasn't a spontaneous moment of inspiration. It was slow, bureaucratic design by committee. And not everyone liked the result. In a private letter, Benjamin Franklin mocked the eagle as a bird of bad moral character, a lazy thief that lets smaller birds do the hard work. He contrasted it with the turkey, which he called a much more respectable bird and a true original native of America. The bald eagle became the national emblem, but it did so over debate, compromise, and even a bit of ridicule. 51. Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey as the national bird officially. The turkey story usually gets told as if Franklin marched into Congress, slammed a bird on the table, and demanded a vote. In reality, he never formally proposed the turkey as the national symbol. His famous comments come from a private 1784 letter to his daughter, where he gently complains about the chosen Great Seal and riffs, half serious and half humorous, about bird morality. He calls the eagle a coward and a cheat, and the turkey, a little vain and silly, but brave and indigenous. It's witty, not legislative. There's no record of Franklin introducing a resolution, lobbying colleagues, or submitting a turkey design to any Great Seal committee. The idea that he wanted the turkey as the national bird takes one private, tongue-in-cheek letter and turns it into an official policy battle that never actually happened. 52. Franklin discovered electricity. Entirely a lone modern myth often presents Franklin as a lone genius, summoning lightning out of nowhere, as if he personally discovered electricity with nothing but a kite and a key. By the time Franklin seriously studied electricity in the 1740s and 1750s, European experimenters had already been playing with electrified glass tubes, Leyden jars, and sparks for years. Franklin read their work, corresponded with scientists in Britain and Europe, and built his experiments on their findings. His real contribution wasn't inventing electricity but explaining and systematizing it. He popularized the idea of positive and negative charge, described conservation of charge, and suggested that lightning was an electrical phenomenon, not divine anger. He designed the lightning rod, which saved buildings and lives. His book, Experiments and Observations on Electricity, made him famous on both sides of the Atlantic. Franklin stood in a crowded lab, not on an empty mountaintop. 53. Franklin's kite experiment was exactly as textbooks show. The classic scene is almost cinematic. A thunderstorm, Franklin flying a kite with a key on the string. Lightning strikes, and he triumphantly bottles electricity. Textbooks and children's books repeat it, as if there's a photograph. In reality, the details are murky, and historians debate what exactly happened. Our main account comes from Franklin himself, written after the fact in cautious technical language. He never describes being directly struck by lightning. The safer version suggests he flew the kite to draw charge from a stormy atmosphere into a key and Leyden jar, observing sparks and proving that storm clouds carried electricity. Some scholars doubt the experiment happened exactly as described, because done recklessly it would almost certainly have killed him. Variants of the story were later embellished to make him sound more heroic and reckless. The simple school version, man, key, one big lightning bolt, is a dramatized shorthand for a more complex, uncertain series of tests. 54. Franklin was president of the United States. Franklin's face shows up everywhere, on money, in classrooms, in patriotic art, so he often gets mentally filed with Washington, Adams, and Jefferson as one of the presidents. He never served as president under the Constitution. The office of President of the United States as we know it began in 1789 with George Washington's election. Franklin, by then in his 80s, was a delegate at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and a crucial elder statesman, but he was never a serious candidate for the new executive role. Earlier, under the Articles of Confederation, there was a President of Congress, a largely ceremonial presiding officer, not a national executive. Franklin didn't hold that job either. What he did do was serve as president of Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council, effectively the head of Pennsylvania's state government for a time. Calling him President of the United States takes his regional title and retrofits it into a role he never held. 55. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were always friends. Images of Adams and Jefferson often lean into a storybook narrative. Two brilliant patriots, lifelong best friends, writing the script of freedom together from start to finish. Reality was much messier. They were close allies during the Revolution, worked together in Europe, and respected each other's minds. But by the 1790s, as political parties formed, they ended up on opposite sides. Adams drifted toward the Federalists. Jefferson became the leading Democratic Republican. The presidential election of 1800 turned their rivalry vicious, with partisan newspapers slinging insults, questioning character, and stoking fear. Their relationship collapsed. Years passed with little contact and plenty of bitterness. Only in 1812, after Adams wrote a cautious New Year's letter, and Jefferson replied, did they begin a remarkable late-life correspondence. They exchanged dozens of letters over the next 14 years, debating philosophy, memory, and mortality. They died on the same day, July 4, 1826, not as unbroken childhood pals, but as reconciled old rivals. 56. Adams was unimportant to independence because Jefferson wrote the soaring phrases of the Declaration. He often gets cast as the undisputed main character of independence, while John Adams fades into the background as an irritable side figure. Inside the Continental Congress, though Adams was anything but minor, he served on countless committees, pushed tirelessly for the creation of a Continental Army, and argued relentlessly for a clean break with Britain when many delegates still hoped for reconciliation. During the heated debates of June and July 1776, he gave what colleagues later described as long, forceful speeches in favor of independence, working the room when the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Jefferson himself later called Adams the Colossus of Independence and said that in Congress he was the revolution's great leader. He also referred to Adams as its indispensable man on the floor. The myth that Adams was unimportant survives mostly because he didn't write the famous sentences that made it onto posters. History inside the chamber tells a different story. 57. John Adams defended the Boston Massacre because he loved Britain. Adams defending British soldiers after the Boston Massacre gets retold like a loyalty test he failed. The spin is that patriots loved liberty, Tories loved the king, and Adams' choice to represent the Redcoats proves he secretly leaned royalist. Adams saw it very differently. He believed that if Boston wanted to call itself civilized, even hated defendants deserved a fair trial and a real defense. When he took the case in 1770, he knew it could ruin his reputation among radicals. He did it anyway, because due process mattered more to him than street opinion. In court, he argued that the soldiers had been provoked by a hostile crowd and that emotion shouldn't replace evidence. Most of the soldiers were acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter instead of murder. Later, Adams called that defense one of the best services he ever rendered his country. He wasn't defending royal policy. He was defending the idea that law should be stronger than rage. 58. The Boston Massacre was an organized slaughter. The phrase Boston Massacre makes it sound like British officers calmly ordered a planned execution of unarmed colonists, lined up in neat rows for target practice. The real event in March 1770 was uglier, messier, and much more confusing. It began as a street confrontation. Angry townspeople, snowballs and chunks of ice, insults, a lone sentry, then reinforcements, then a tense standoff in the dark. Witnesses disagreed about almost everything. Who shouted what? Whether someone yelled fire, whether the soldiers were hit first, how many shots they heard. The troops had loaded muskets and were terrified of the crowd pressing in. When one gun went off, the others followed in seconds, a chain reaction of panic and poor discipline. 5 colonists were killed, not dozens. There's no solid evidence of a premeditated order from high command to stage a public slaughter. The massacre became organized in the aftermath, through broadsides, engravings, and rhetoric that polished chaos into a clearer villain. 59. Crispus Attucks was the only victim of the Boston Massacre. Crispus Attucks appears in simplified versions of the story as the lone casualty of the Boston Massacre, the single body lying on the snow. He was real and important, but he was not alone. 5 men died that night or soon after: Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr. Attucks was of African and native descent, probably formerly enslaved, working as a sailor and dock worker in a port city already on edge. Witnesses placed him near the front of the crowd when the shooting started. In Adams' later courtroom argument, Attucks was portrayed as a ringleader. Patriots later turned that same central role into a symbol of resistance. Over time, especially in abolitionist writing and later civil rights narratives, Attucks came to stand in for all 5 victims and for Black participation in the struggle for liberty. Remembering him matters, but collapsing the other names into silence distorts how many people actually died on that cold Boston street. 60. Samuel Adams only cared about mob agitation. Samuel Adams often gets flattened into a stock character, a beer logo revolutionary shouting at taverns, whipping up mobs, and throwing tea. He did help organize street protests and knew how to harness public anger, but that was only part of his work. Behind the bonfires and broadsides, he was a patient organizer of information and networks. In 1772, when tension with Britain was simmering but not yet boiling, he helped create the Boston Committee of Correspondence, a local body to share news and coordinate response. Within a few years, similar committees spread through Massachusetts and other colonies, forming a communication web that could circulate arguments, resolutions, and warnings faster than British officials could react. Adams wrote essays under pseudonyms, drafted instructions for town meetings, and built a kind of political infrastructure that didn't rely solely on the street. The rabble-rouser label is convenient, but he was also an early strategist of decentralized resistance, less accidental riot, more deliberate system. 61. Patrick Henry actually said, "Give me liberty or give me death," exactly as remembered Patrick Henry's famous line gets quoted like a tape recording, the exact words echoing perfectly from 1775 to now. No one wrote down the speech as he delivered it. The version school books love came from William Wirt, a biographer who published his account more than 40 years later. Wirt admitted he had no shorthand transcript. Instead, he wrote the speech from the memories of older men who claimed to have heard it, men reconstructing the drama of their youth in an era when the revolution had already become legend. The stirring climax, "Give me liberty or give me death," fits Henry's fiery style, but there's no contemporaneous record proving he phrased it that way. Earlier sources barely summarize what he said. Over time, the reconstructed line hardened into canonical history. Henry likely gave a passionate argument for arming Virginia, but the specific words we repeat at rallies and in movies are at least partly a polished 19th century script, not a stenographer's record. 62. Founding speeches survive as exact transcripts. It's tempting to imagine every famous founding speech stored somewhere in a neat folder, captured word for word by diligent note-takers in powdered wigs. In reality, much of what we think we know about those speeches comes from later recollections, partial notes, and polished rewrites. The Constitutional Convention deliberately kept its proceedings secret, and no official transcripts of the debates were published at the time. James Madison's notes, a major source for what we think was said, were edited and revised by him over years before they saw print. Other speeches, from town halls to state ratifying conventions, survive only as summaries in newspapers, which often paraphrased or embellished for partisan effect. Biographers in the 1800s reconstructed grand orations from fragments and memories, smoothing rough talk into perfect rhetoric. When you see a founder's quote ending in a flawless rhetorical flourish, it may reflect how later generations thought they should have spoken, not how they actually did in a crowded, noisy hall. 63. James Madison was a loud, dominant orator, with a nickname like Father of the Constitution. It's easy to picture Madison standing at the front of the room, booming voice, commanding presence, silencing opponents with thunderous speeches. Contemporary accounts describe almost the opposite. Madison was physically slight, often sickly, with a weak speaking voice that struggled to carry in large spaces. He was not a natural crowd grabber like Patrick Henry, or a theatrical presence like some of his peers. His strength lay in preparation, detail, and writing. At the Constitutional Convention, his power came from the Virginia plan he helped craft before anyone else arrived, from his relentless work in committees, and from his careful note-taking. Later, the Federalist Papers, many written by Madison, shaped the way Americans understood the new Constitution far more than any single speech he shouted from a balcony. He influenced debates by drafting texts others debated, supplying arguments they quoted, and quietly steering structure rather than dominating the room with volume. 64. Madison single-handedly wrote the Constitution, calling Madison the father of the Constitution. Sets you up for a very convenient myth, one genius in a quiet room drafting America, while everyone else nods obediently. Madison did arrive in Philadelphia in 1787 with a plan, the Virginia Plan, already sketched out. It proposed a strong national government, a bicameral legislature, and a system that tilted toward big states. That blueprint shaped early debate and gave the convention a starting point. But once the delegates actually got to work, the document became a messy group project. Large and small states fought over representation. Southern and Northern delegates clashed over slavery, trade, and taxation. The final structure, with equal representation in the Senate and proportional representation in the House, looked very different from Madison's original design. He even lost some of the arguments he cared about most, like giving Congress a sweeping veto over state laws. Madison's influence was huge, but the finished Constitution is a patchwork of compromises, not the pure expression of one man's pen. 65. Madison opposed the Bill of Rights entirely. It's easy to tell this one as a neat contradiction. Madison hated a Bill of Rights, then did a total 180 for no reason. In reality, his early skepticism was more technical than tyrannical. Madison worried that listing some rights might imply that unlisted rights didn't exist, and he thought structural safeguards, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, would do more to restrain government than poetic promises on parchment. During the ratification debates, though, anti-federalists hammered the Constitution for lacking explicit protections. Several states ratified only while demanding amendments. Madison saw that refusing to budge risked delegitimizing the new government he'd worked so hard to build. In the first Congress, he reversed course in practice if not in logic. He collected state proposals, distilled them, and became the floor manager for what became the Bill of Rights. The man who once doubted their necessity ended up shepherding them through committee and debate. He didn't start as their biggest fan, but he became their chief engineer. 66. The Bill of Rights was in the original Constitution. Schoolbook timelines often blur this one until it feels like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights arrived as a single package deal, like a phone and its charger. The document signed in Philadelphia in 1787 had no Bill of Rights. It was a framework for government, structure, powers, procedures, lots of machinery, very few explicit personal protections. That absence became one of the anti-federalists' main weapons. Writers like Brutus and Federal Farmer argued that a powerful new central government needed clear limits, not just assurances of good behavior. During the ratification struggle, several states demanded amendments as the price of their yes vote. They ratified while issuing lists of recommended protections, including free speech, jury trials, and bans on general warrants. Only after the Constitution was in force did Congress draft and pass what became the first 10 amendments in 1789. They were ratified by the states and took effect in 1791. The Bill of Rights is not the foundation of the Constitution, it's an early renovation. 67. The First Amendment instantly applied to states. Modern Americans talk about First Amendment rights like a shield you can raise against any government action, federal or state, local cop or city council. At the founding, the First Amendment was drafted as a leash on Congress, not on state governments. Congress shall make no law was the operative phrase. States already had their own constitutions and declarations of rights, many with protections for speech, religion, and the press on paper. Some enforced them strongly, others not so much. Several state governments restricted dissent, regulated churches, or punished seditious libel, while the federal First Amendment sat quietly aimed only at national laws. It wasn't until after the Civil War, with the 14th Amendment, that a new constitutional tool emerged to apply rights against the states. Even then, the Supreme Court didn't fully embrace that idea for decades. Through a process called incorporation, piece by piece, the court gradually applied most of the Bill of Rights, First Amendment included, to state and local governments. That universal shield is a 20th century development, not an original feature. 68. The Second Amendment had an uncontested original meaning. The modern debate over the Second Amendment often gets framed like one side is honoring an obvious original meaning, and the other side is inventing something new. At the founding, the text was already a tangle. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, sits right next to the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Some founders emphasized the militia clause. They feared standing armies and saw armed citizens, mustered and trained, as the real defense of liberty. Others also talked about personal self-defense, frontier life, and customary private gun ownership. States passed laws requiring militia-age men to own weapons and appear for training, but they also regulated storage, gunpowder, and when arms could be carried. Early legal commentaries and debates showed disagreement over whether the amendment primarily protected collective military readiness, individual ownership, or both. There was no single uncontested reading everyone agreed on. Argument over how to balance arms, order, and regulation started right away and never really stopped. 69. The founders expected the Supreme Court to be supreme from day one. The phrase Supreme Court makes it sound like everyone in 1787 expected a robed council of final bosses to loom over American politics. In reality, the judicial branch was the least fleshed out part of the original design. Article 3 is short, almost sketchy. One Supreme Court, some lower courts if Congress feels like creating them, jurisdiction over certain cases. That's it. Many delegates at the Constitutional Convention worried more about Congress dominating everything than about judges taking over. Some even expected state courts to handle most disputes, and for federal courts to be relatively modest. The first Congress had to pass the Judiciary Act of 1789 just to build the system's basic scaffolding. How many justices, what kinds of cases, where they sat. Early chief justices sometimes rode around the country on horseback, riding circuit, hearing cases like traveling officials, not untouchable oracles. The idea of the Supreme Court as the ultimate arbiter of constitutional meaning, able to strike down federal and state laws with sweeping authority, evolved over time through politics, precedent, and power struggles, not from a clearly settled 1787 blueprint. 70. Marbury v. Madison created judicial review from nothing. Marbury v. Madison in 1803 gets taught like a magic trick. One case, one opinion, poof, judicial review appears as if it had never existed. Chief Justice John Marshall's decision was important, but he wasn't inventing the concept out of thin air. Before the Constitution, several state courts had already asserted the power to refuse enforcement of laws they saw as conflicting with state constitutions. During the ratification debates, Federalists reassured skeptics by arguing that independent courts would naturally treat unconstitutional acts as void. Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist No. 78 that if a law conflicted with the Constitution, judges should follow the Constitution. Early federal judges hinted at this role in a few cases before Marbury. What Marshall did was seize a politically awkward dispute about undelivered judicial commissions and use it to clearly state, in a single dramatic opinion, that the Supreme Court could strike down an act of Congress as inconsistent with the Constitution. He also cleverly avoided a direct confrontation with President Jefferson. Judicial review didn't begin in 1803. Marbury simply planted a flag where earlier practice and theory had already been heading. 71. The 3/5 compromise meant enslaved people were considered 3/5 human. The phrase 3/5 of all other persons sits in the Constitution like a wound, and people often repeat the story that the founding generation literally believed black people were 3/5 human. The grotesque reality is different and somehow worse. Nobody in Philadelphia was confused about whether enslaved people were human. They were arguing over whether human beings held as property should count to give their enslavers more political power. Southern states wanted to count enslaved people fully for representation in the House, even though those people had no rights and no vote. Northern delegates argued they shouldn't be counted at all if they weren't treated as citizens. The final compromise said enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person for apportioning seats and taxes. That fraction was a cold political formula, not a metaphysical judgment. It inflated slaveholding states' clout in Congress and the Electoral College while giving enslaved people nothing. The Constitution turned their stolen lives into fractions for someone else's representation. 72. The Constitution never mentions slavery textbooks. Sometimes say the framers were too noble or too embarrassed to mention slavery, as if silence meant disapproval. The reality is that the word slavery never appears, but slavery is baked into the structure anyway. The Constitution refers to other persons in the 3/5 clause, persons held to service or labor in the Fugitive Slave Clause, and bans Congress from prohibiting the migration or importation of such persons before 1808. These awkward euphemisms are not accidents. Delegates like James Madison later admitted they avoided the word slavery because it looked bad on paper for a country shouting about liberty. But they still wrote protections that safeguarded slaveholders' property, their power in Congress, and their ability to reclaim people who escaped across state lines. The document gave slave states extra representation, shielded the Atlantic trade for a time, and committed the federal government to help enforce bondage, all without saying the quiet part out loud. It didn't ignore slavery. It encoded it in careful, lawyerly language. 73. The founders banned the slave trade immediately. The story that the founders heroically ended the transatlantic slave trade right away offers a comforting arc. Yes, there was slavery, but they quickly started fixing it. In Philadelphia, some delegates did want to halt the importation of enslaved Africans, both for moral reasons and to favor domestic markets. Others, particularly from South Carolina and Georgia, threatened to walk out if the trade was even touched. The compromise in Article I, Section 9 is blunt. Congress could not prohibit the migration or importation of such persons the states saw fit to admit before 1808. That is a 20-year constitutional shield for human trafficking. Between ratification and 1808, tens of thousands more Africans were kidnapped, transported, and sold into American slavery under that protection. When Congress finally passed a ban effective in 1808, it didn't end slavery itself, and enforcement was spotty. Smuggling continued. Calling this delay a moral triumph lets everyone skip the part where the Constitution explicitly locked in 2 extra decades of legal human importation to appease slaveholding interests. 74. Northern states ended slavery overnight. It's tempting to carve the early United States into clean moral geography. Bad slave South, good free North, with emancipation happening at the stroke of a pen. In reality, Northern emancipation was slow, conditional, and full of loopholes. States like Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey passed gradual abolition laws that freed no one immediately. Instead, they declared that children born to enslaved mothers after a certain date would be free, after serving their mother's owner, until age 21, 25, or even 28. People already enslaved stayed enslaved for life unless their owners chose otherwise. Some Northern enslavers shuffled people across state lines to avoid losing them. Others reclassified bondage as long-term apprenticeships. In New York, slavery remained legal until 1827. In New Jersey, until 1865, there were still apprentice-for-life black people on census records. Northern states also profited from the slave economy through shipping, insurance, finance, and textile mills. Emancipation, there was not a clean moral break. It was a long, uneven unwinding that left many people in chains for decades. 75. The revolution improved freedom for everyone. We talk about the American Revolution like a universal sunrise, the dawn of liberty bathing everyone in equal light. But the new republic rearranged power in ways that expanded freedom for some and narrowed it for others. Many white male property holders gained more say in government as states dropped certain restrictions and experimented with broader voting rules. At the same time, loyalists who had supported Britain saw property confiscated, families threatened, or were driven into exile in Canada, the Caribbean, or England. Native nations who had been courted by both sides during the war watched their lands swallowed even faster once the British Crown's limits on westward expansion vanished. Treaties were made and broken, violent dispossession accelerated. Enslaved people who'd fled to British lines based on promises of freedom were often re-enslaved or forced into desperate migrations. Women who had managed farms, businesses, and even intelligence work during the war saw political doors slam shut afterward. Most states explicitly tied voting and office holding to male status. The revolution created a republic, but not a universal emancipation. 76. Women played no political role in the founding era. The standard narrative keeps the big political drama on stage with men in wigs, while women hover off to the side boiling water and darning socks. In reality, women were woven into the political fabric from the start, even if laws refused to admit it. During the imperial crisis, women organized and enforced boycotts of British goods, refused taxed tea, and made homespun cloth, turning their households into engines of economic resistance. They wrote political essays and poems under their own names and pseudonyms, arguing for Republican virtue and criticizing corruption. Mercy Otis Warren lampooned British officials in popular plays, and later wrote a multi-volume history of the Revolution. Ordinary women confronted merchants and hoarders in food riots, insisting on fair prices as part of the common good. Legally, almost all women were excluded from formal power. No voting, no office holding in most states, but the ideal of Republican motherhood emerged, casting them as the shapers of future citizens' minds. That role, teaching sons about liberty and virtue, was itself a form of political influence, even as the law kept them in civil subordination. 77. Abigail Adams was merely a supportive spouse. Abigail Adams often gets reduced to a sentimental figure in the background of John Adams's career, a devoted wife writing sweet letters from home. Her correspondence reads very differently. She was sharply observant about politics, economics, and foreign affairs. While John was in Philadelphia, she managed the family farm, supervised workers, navigated shortages, and reported on wartime conditions with a level of detail any modern policy memo would envy. In March 1776, she wrote her famous Remember the Lady's Letter, warning that if lawmakers gave unchecked power to husbands, women might foment a rebellion. That wasn't a joke. It was a pointed critique of building a republic on male dominance. She criticized slavery, calling it a most iniquitous scheme, and expressed discomfort with the hypocrisy of freedom talk from slaveholders. Abigail was not sitting quietly on the sidelines. She was advising, arguing, and sometimes scolding. John Adams didn't always take her advice, but he took it seriously enough to debate it. Her letters are a running commentary on the founding, showing a mind fully engaged with the new nation's contradictions. 78. Abigail Adams's Remember the Ladies changed the Constitution. Abigail's March 1776 letter to John Adams, the one every textbook now quotes for the phrase "Remember the Ladies," gets retold like a hinge moment in women's rights. The way the story goes, she warned the founders not to ignore women. John wrote back something teasing but respectful, and the seed of future equality was planted in the constitutional soil. The uncomfortable reality is that her warning hit a brick wall. John's reply wasn't just playful. He brushed her off and joked about a despotism of the petticoat, assuring her that men had no intention of surrendering their power. In Philadelphia, no one rewrote a single clause because of her words. The Declaration didn't mention women. The state constitutions didn't suddenly grant them political rights. The federal constitution in 1787 locked voting into state rules that almost always meant men only. Abigail kept pressing in later letters, criticizing coverture and male legal dominance, but there was no immediate legal transformation, no hidden women's rights provision slipped into the document. Her letter survived as a moral indictment, not a constitutional turning point, proof that some people clearly saw the injustice, while the new republic politely ignored it. 79. Martha Washington lived quietly outside politics. Martha Washington gets slotted into the role of gentle colonial grandmother, pouring tea, knitting, and waiting patiently for George to come home from greatness. That image erases the reality of a woman deeply embedded in the political world of the founding, even if she never held office or wrote fiery pamphlets. When George took command of the Continental Army, Martha didn't stay tucked away at Mount Vernon. She traveled repeatedly to winter encampments like Valley Forge and Morristown, managing social life in camp, hosting officers, and turning the commander-in-chief's quarters into a kind of political salon. Those dinners and visits were not idle chatter. They were where relationships were built, grievances soothed, and morale shored up. While George was away for years, she oversaw plantations, enslaved laborers, finances, and complex logistics with a level of authority that contradicts the idea of a passive spouse. As First Lady, a role that didn't yet have a script, she hosted weekly public receptions in New York and Philadelphia, becoming a living symbol of Republican respectability and stability. She disliked the public glare and insisted she wasn't political, but her choices and presence helped legitimize the new presidency and give it a human face. Quiet did not mean irrelevant. 80. Native Americans were peripheral to the founding standard. Founding narratives treat native nations like background scenery, there for a few skirmishes, then fading into the wilderness, while white colonists argue about taxes and liberty. In reality, indigenous nations were at the center of imperial strategy, revolutionary planning, and early U.S. statecraft. Control of native land was the core prize in the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes, and the Southeast. British policies, like the Proclamation Line, tried to manage that contest precisely because native power mattered. During the Revolution, both the British and the Americans courted native alliances, traded gifts, and negotiated treaties, understanding that warriors and territory could tilt campaigns. Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Creek, Cherokee, Shawnee, and many others weighed their options based on long histories with each empire, not out of some vague loyalty. After independence, the federal government poured time and money into treaties, land cessions, and military campaigns on the frontier. Presidents and congressmen argued more over Western land and native relations than almost any other single issue. The new republic's finances depended on selling Western tracts claimed through those negotiations and wars. Native Americans weren't peripheral. Their dispossession was a central engine of early American growth. 81. All native nations supported Britain. There's a neat myth that simplifies the revolution into a moral map. Freedom-loving colonists versus tyrannical Britain, with all native nations lined up on the British side as natural enemies of American independence. The actual alliances were fractured, strategic, and shifting. Some indigenous groups did ally with the British, often because the Crown, for all its failures, at least sometimes enforced limits on colonial land grabs. Others tried hard to remain neutral, seeing the war as a fight between two sets of invaders and hoping to survive whoever won. Within confederacies like the Haudenosaunee, communities split. Some Mohawk and Seneca fought alongside the British. Some Oneida and Tuscarora joined the Americans, serving as scouts, warriors, and guides. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. Individual leaders made choices based on local pressures, past betrayals, promises of weapons or trade goods, and hopes of preserving territory. Even after the war, some native nations negotiated directly with the United States, while others continued resistance in alliance with British posts in Canada. Saying they all backed Britain flattens a landscape of hard decisions, internal debates, and calculated risks taken under catastrophic pressure. Indigenous politics didn't disappear in 1776. They adapted to a new imperial arrangement. 82. The Proclamation Line of 1763 barely mattered. The Proclamation Line of 1763 often shows up in textbooks as a footnote, a British decree drawing an imaginary line along the Appalachians and telling colonists not to cross. The story usually shrugs it off as unenforceable and mostly ignored, as if it were a minor bureaucratic misstep. To many colonists and future founders, it was infuriating. The 7 Years' War had been fought partly over who controlled the Ohio Valley and western lands. Colonists had bled and gone into debt, expecting that victory would open vast tracts for settlement and speculation. Men like George Washington and other colonial elites held paper claims to western lands they expected to cash in. The proclamation declared that those lands were off limits to private purchase and settlement, reserved for native nations under imperial supervision. That meant London, not local assemblies or speculators, would control the pace and terms of expansion. Settlers kept slipping over the line, and many land companies lobbied hard for exceptions, but the symbolic insult stuck. The boundary represented imperial meddling in what colonists saw as their reward and their future. It's no accident that Western land grievances appear again and again in their complaints against Britain. For people invested, literally in expansion, the line didn't barely matter. It was a red flag. 83. The founders wanted peaceful expansion only in national myths. The founders loved treaties, reasoned negotiation, and gradual civilizing on the frontier, as if the United States always preferred peaceful expansion but was tragically forced into conflict. Their actual behavior around land reads much more like aggressive acquisition, dressed in legal language. Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, and many other leading figures held or speculated in Western land claims, often overlapping with native homelands. They supported treaties, but those treaties were frequently made under military pressure, economic coercion, or after punitive expeditions. When native leaders resisted new surveys and settlements, officials framed them as unreasonable obstacles to progress. Campaigns like Sullivan's 1779 marched through Iroquois territory during the Revolution, burning villages and crops to break resistance, were not accidents. They were deliberate strategies to clear native presence. Jefferson himself spoke in one breath about justice and in another about moving indigenous people beyond the Mississippi if they wouldn't assimilate on U.S. terms. After independence, the new government repeatedly used debt, trade dependence, and the threat of force to pry land cessions from native nations. Peaceful expansion was the rhetoric. The practice mixed guns, hunger, and paperwork to produce a constant grinding push west. 84. The Northwest Ordinance solved frontier conflict fairly. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 often gets praised as a model of enlightened state building. It banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, set up a process for new states to join the Union as equals, and supposedly offered a fair, orderly framework for settling the frontier. That glowing description leaves out who paid the price. The ordinance treated the vast region north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi as if it were largely empty space waiting to be surveyed and parceled, when in reality it was home to powerful native nations, the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, Wyandot, and many others with their own political structures and land systems. The text ceremonially promised that their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent, but consent in practice meant signatures on treaties obtained after military campaigns, retaliatory raids, or years of hunger tied to disrupted hunting grounds and trade. As American settlers flooded in under the promise of future statehood, violence spiked. The 1790s saw some of the most devastating conflicts in early U.S. history, culminating in the crushing of a native confederacy at fallen timbers and massive land cessions. The ordinance did organize territory and set a precedent against slavery's expansion in that region, but it also smoothed the legal path for rapid dispossession. Calling it fair ignores how its neat grids and stages of government rested on pushing native nations off the map. 85. The founders trusted standing armies. One of the most persistent myths about the founding era is that the men who wrote the Constitution trusted the idea of a large, permanent national army, like the one the United States keeps today. In reality, many of them were terrified of it. They had just fought a war against what they saw as British military occupation, redcoats quartered in homes, soldiers enforcing unpopular laws, a professional army that answered to a distant executive. The English political tradition they read warned constantly that standing armies in peacetime were tools of tyranny. So when the new government was being designed, there was deep anxiety about giving the federal state too much military muscle. That's why the Constitution splits war powers between Congress and the President, why it talks about raising armies but keeping a permanent navy, and why the Bill of Rights locks in the right to bear arms and protections against quartering troops. They imagined local militias, not a colossal permanent force with global bases. Hamilton argued for stronger military capacity, but even he wrapped it in reassurances and limits. Trust wasn't the baseline, suspicion was. The modern assumption that the founders loved big armies runs directly against their own debates. 86. The founders wanted a weak federal government. It's easy to look at modern anti-federal rhetoric and project it backward, assuming the founders as a group wanted a tiny, neutered central government that mostly stayed out of everyone's way. That picture fits the Articles of Confederation, not the Constitution that replaced them. Under the Articles, the national government couldn't reliably tax, regulate interstate trade, or enforce its own treaties. States printed their own money, erected trade barriers, ignored requisitions, and sometimes flirted with separate diplomacy. Many of the same leaders we later call founders watched that system wobble and concluded it was a failure. The Federalists, Hamilton, Madison, Washington, Jay, and their allies, organized explicitly to push a stronger national authority. They wanted Congress to levy taxes directly, control commerce, raise troops, and bind the states with federal law declared supreme. The Constitutional Convention wasn't a fine-tuning session. It was a full reboot, scrapping the Articles in favor of a much more powerful center. Yes, there were deep disagreements over how strong that center should be, and anti-federalists fought back hard. But the Constitution's entire purpose was to build a more muscular federal government than the fragile league that came before. Weakness was what they were trying to escape. 87. The Articles of Confederation worked fine until politicians interfered. Nostalgia for the Articles of Confederation imagines a golden age of local control that would have lasted indefinitely if ambitious politicians hadn't meddled with a perfectly good system. The record from the 1780s tells a different story, a national government that could beg but not command, plead but not enforce. Congress had no direct power to tax. It had to ask states for money and hope they paid. Most didn't, or sent fractions of what was requested, leaving soldiers unpaid, debts mounting, and foreign creditors unimpressed. Congress couldn't regulate interstate commerce, so states slapped tariffs on each other and engaged in their own little trade wars. British troops lingered in Western forts in violation of the peace treaty, and Congress lacked the leverage or resources to force them out. Foreign powers saw the Confederation as weak and divided, and they were right. When uprisings, border disputes, and currency chaos rippled through the states, there was no reliable central mechanism to coordinate responses. The push for change wasn't just elite ambition, it was a reaction to a structure that struggled to perform basic functions of a national state. The Articles weren't sabotaged from outside, they were structurally inadequate from the inside. 88. Shays' Rebellion was a minor local disturbance in school. Shays' Rebellion sometimes gets reduced to a quirky side note, a small group of angry farmers in Massachusetts causing a bit of trouble before being easily put down. That framing ignores how profoundly it rattled the men shaping the new nation. In 1786 and 1787, debt-ridden farmers in western Massachusetts, many of them veterans, faced foreclosures and harsh tax collection. They organized, closed courts, and eventually marched on the state arsenal at Springfield. To the people living through it, this didn't look like a quaint protest. It looked like the possibility of revolutionary chaos turning inward. State leaders struggled to respond, scrambling to raise militia forces and private funds because the Confederation government had neither money nor troops to send. Washington watched from Virginia deeply alarmed. Elites saw in Shays' movement a warning that Republican government could collapse into anarchy when property and order seemed threatened. In letters and speeches, they explicitly invoked the rebellion as Exhibit A for why a stronger federal framework was needed. When delegates met in Philadelphia in 1787, Shays' Rebellion hovered like a ghost in the room, shorthand for everything that could go wrong under a weak central regime. Minor is not how they described it. 89. The Constitutional Convention was public and transparent. The phrase "we the people" makes it easy to imagine the Constitution being hammered out in some open, town hall-style gathering, with citizens coming and going, watching the debates and reporting back home. What actually happened in Philadelphia in 1787 was far more closed. Delegates met behind locked doors in the Pennsylvania State House. They kept the windows shut despite the brutal summer heat to prevent eavesdropping. They agreed formally to secrecy, no public release of debates, no detailed minutes shared. James Madison took extensive notes, but those stayed hidden for decades. Newspapers were fed only vague updates, usually about procedural matters. Even some state-level politicians had little idea what was being proposed until the final document emerged in September. The official story released to the public was essentially, "The convention recommends this new constitution, please ratify." The secrecy had reasons. Delegates argued they needed freedom to change their minds and float unpopular ideas without immediate backlash. But it also meant that one of the most important political redesigns in American history unfolded out of public view. The ratification debates that followed were noisy and very public. The drafting process that created the document was intentionally opaque. 90. The Constitution was ratified unanimously today. The Constitution can feel inevitable, like a document everyone immediately recognized as genius and embraced without serious dissent. Early American reality was much messier. Ratification was not a unanimous national chorus. It was a bitter state-by-state battle conducted in newspapers, taverns, meeting halls, and special conventions. In some states like Delaware, support came quickly. In others, the debates were razor-thin. Massachusetts only ratified after Federalists promised to support amendments, promises that paved the way for the Bill of Rights. New York's convention was fiercely divided, with powerful anti-Federalists like George Clinton and a substantial opposition in the countryside. Virginia saw towering figures on both sides, Madison and Washington favoring the Constitution, Patrick Henry and George Mason warning against it. The final vote margins in key states were far from unanimous. They were narrow enough that a swing of a few delegates could have changed history. Rhode Island refused to even send delegates to the Philadelphia Convention and initially rejected the Constitution outright, only ratifying in 1790 under heavy economic pressure, long after the new government was already operating. The document's authority grew over time, but its birth was contested, fought over, and anything but universal. 91. Anti-Federalists were anti-Constitution ignoramuses. A comforting myth paints the Federalists as enlightened architects and the Anti-Federalists as backward, uninformed obstructionists who simply didn't understand what a modern nation needed. That caricature erases a sophisticated, if ultimately losing, political critique. Anti-Federalist writers and speakers, many under pen names like Brutus, Sentinel, and the Federal Farmer, read the proposed Constitution carefully and articulated specific worries. They feared a distant, consolidated national government would swallow state sovereignty, drain local accountability, and recreate the kind of power they had just resisted in Britain. They pointed to the necessary and proper clause and the sweeping tax powers as seeds of future overreach. They warned that a large republic covering vast territory would struggle to maintain real representation, leaving ordinary people effectively voiceless under a thin veneer of elections. Crucially, they demanded a Bill of Rights, arguing that without explicit protections, individual liberties would be vulnerable. They weren't blindly anti-Constitution. Many proposed their own amendments or alternative structures. Some of their predictions about expansion of federal power, about the influence of elites, about standing armies and central bureaucracy echo eerily across later centuries. The Federalists won the framing war, but treating their opponents as ignorant misses how much of the eventual constitutional settlement, including the Bill of Rights, came from anti-Federalist pressure. 92. The Federalist Papers were the Constitution itself. There's a modern habit of treating the Federalist Papers like they're some hidden bonus level of the Constitution, as if the essays themselves are binding law that somehow sit alongside the text ratified in 1788. That's not what they were. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay weren't acting as official interpreters of a finished document. They were salesmen for a proposal that hadn't been adopted yet. Their essays ran in New York newspapers under the shared pen name, Publius, aimed at persuading skeptical voters and delegates that this new frame of government wasn't a looming tyranny. A lot of what they said was spin, reassurance, and sometimes strategic vagueness tailored to the politics of ratification. Some arguments contradicted what the same men would claim later once they were in power or in opposition. The Constitution that became supreme law is the short, dry legal text, plus the later amendments, not the op-eds written to get it passed. Courts and scholars cite the Federalist to understand how some framers wanted people to feel about the Constitution, but that's very different from treating those essays as if they were adopted clauses. They were persuasion, not scripture. 93. Federalist number 10 ended factional conflict. Forever people talk about Federalist number 10. Like Madison discovered a cheat code that permanently ended political faction, as if the essay solved partisanship in theory and therefore somehow in reality. In the actual text, Madison is brutally clear. You can't get rid of factions without destroying liberty, because factions are just people organizing around shared interests and passions. His goal wasn't elimination, it was containment. He argued that a large republic with many competing interests would make it harder for any single faction to grab total control and oppress everyone else. The extended sphere, layered institutions, and representation would dilute extremes, not abolish them. Then, after all that elegant theory, the very men who praised Federalist 10 immediately formed factions. Federalists and Democratic Republicans, newspaper networks, party caucuses, bitter elections. Madison himself helped build one of the first national parties to oppose Hamilton's program. Far from ending faction, the Constitution created a playground where factions could operate, bargain, and fight within a structured arena. The essay is a warning label and a management plan, not a magic spell. Factional conflict didn't disappear. It became the permanent condition of American politics. 94. Thomas Jefferson hated farmers' debt relief. Always Jefferson often gets cast as the stern landlord of the early republic, supposedly horrified whenever indebted farmers pushed for relief from taxes, foreclosures, or hard money creditors. That picture fits the Federalist caricature of mob rule, not Jefferson's more complicated record. He idealized the independent yeoman farmer, the small landholder whose modest property supposedly anchored Republican virtue. When rural debtors in the 1780s and 1790s demanded policies like paper money, easier credit, or leniency from harsh courts, Jefferson was sometimes more sympathetic than the hardline Federalists who saw any relaxation as an attack on property. He criticized governments that piled regressive taxes on poor farmers while protecting wealthy speculators and urban creditors. From France in the 1780s, he watched Shays' Rebellion and wrote that occasional uprisings were a sign of a living republic, not automatic proof of degeneracy. He didn't endorse every tactic or demand, and he was himself a large slaveholding planter, deeply entangled in debt. But he wasn't reliably on the side of creditors. He worried about concentrated wealth strangling small producers. The reality is that Jefferson's rhetoric often leaned toward understanding rural distress, even when his own class interests pulled the other way. 95. The Louisiana Purchase was obviously constitutional to Jefferson. Looking backward, the Louisiana Purchase feels like such an obvious win that people assume every founder instantly saw it as both brilliant and clearly constitutional. Jefferson didn't. Publicly, he presented the acquisition of a vast new empire of land from France as a triumph for farmers and security. Privately, it gave his constitutional conscience heartburn. Jefferson had spent years preaching a strict construction of federal power, insisting that the government could only do what the Constitution explicitly authorized. There is no neat little clause saying, the United States may double its territory by buying half a continent from Napoleon. In letters, Jefferson toyed with drafting a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase, worrying that otherwise he was breaking his own interpretive rules. He even wrote out proposed amendment language. But the diplomatic window was narrow, Napoleon was unpredictable, and Jefferson's advisors pushed him to act fast. In the end, he accepted a looser reading of the treaty-making power and went forward without an amendment. The man who had warned against implied powers used an implied power to pull off his biggest achievement. The purchase wasn't obviously constitutional to him. It was a conscious, uneasy stretch. 96. Jefferson and Madison consistently defended civil liberties. It's comforting to imagine Jefferson and Madison as unwavering guardians of civil liberties, standing above the pettiness of party and power. Their record is more selective. In the late 1790s, they authored the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, denouncing the Alien and Sedition Acts as unconstitutional assaults on free speech and states' rights. They argued that the federal government had no authority to criminalize criticism of officials, and that states could judge and resist such overreach. Those texts later became touchstones for free expression arguments. But the high principle didn't always survive contact with their own agendas. When Jefferson and Madison were in power, they had far less interest in states nullifying federal policy they supported. Jefferson's administration, while milder than the Federalists, still used patronage and political pressure against hostile newspapers. Madison, as president during the War of 1812, signed laws that weren't models of absolute civil liberties purity. Their concern about federal oppression was sharpest when they were out of power and their allies were the targets. When the partisan winds shifted, so did some of their fervor. They advanced important ideas about limits on federal authority, but their defense of liberty was tangled with party strategy and timing. 97. The Alien and Sedition Acts were broadly popular founding measures. The Alien and Sedition Acts sometimes get recast as stern but necessary tools that a united founding generation calmly accepted in a moment of crisis. In reality, they blew up American politics. Passed by the Federalist-controlled Congress in 1798 amid fear of war with France, the laws made it easier to deport non-citizens deemed dangerous, lengthened naturalization periods, and most explosively criminalized false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. Federalists used the Sedition Act to prosecute opposition newspaper editors and Republican activists. Far from enjoying broad support, the measures sparked furious resistance. Jeffersonian Republicans portrayed them as proof that Federalists wanted to crush dissent and slide toward monarchy. Crowds rallied behind persecuted printers. State legislatures denounced the laws. Jefferson and Madison secretly authored the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions as formal protests. In the 1800 election, outrage over the Alien and Sedition Acts became a central issue, helping Jefferson defeat Adams and flip the federal government. The acts were allowed to expire, or were repealed. They didn't become an enduring part of American law. Broadly popular founding measures is a strange way to describe legislation that helped end the Federalist Party as a national force. 98. Aaron Burr only matters because he shot Hamilton. Aaron Burr has been flattened into a single moment, the vice president who killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel and then faded into villainous obscurity. That's a tiny slice of a much stranger and more consequential career. Before the duel, Burr was a serious national figure, a Revolutionary War officer, a prominent New York lawyer, a U.S. senator, and a capable political organizer who built a powerful New York coalition. In the election of 1800, he tied Jefferson in the Electoral College, triggering a constitutional crisis in the House of Representatives that exposed deep flaws in the original system and led directly to the 12th Amendment. As vice president under Jefferson, Burr presided over the Senate with considerable skill, even while his political base at home crumbled. After the duel, instead of quietly retiring, he became entangled in schemes in the West, flirting with ideas of creating an independent republic in Mexican territory or carving out a breakaway empire in the Trans-Appalachian region. Jefferson's administration eventually charged him with treason. His 1807 trial, overseen by Chief Justice John Marshall, became a landmark in defining treason and executive power, and Burr was acquitted. He was not a footnote created by one pistol shot. He was a central, chaotic figure in the early republic's political experiments and failures. 99. Hamilton died instantly in the duel. The canonical Hamilton story ends with a single shot, an instant death on a misty New Jersey morning, as if a clean, almost theatrical exit somehow dignifies the whole mess. That's the version you get when people want a neat, tragic full stop. The reality was slower, bloodier, and much less romantic. On July 11, 1804, when Aaron Burr's bullet tore into Alexander Hamilton at Weehawken, it didn't kill him on the spot. The ball entered above his right hip, shattered a rib, ripped through his liver and diaphragm, and lodged near his spine. Hamilton collapsed, was carried from the dueling ground, ferried back across the Hudson to New York City, and taken to the home of a friend. He spent the rest of that day and into the next in agony, drifting in and out of lucidity, receiving visitors, saying farewells, and calling for religious comfort. His wife Eliza and their children saw him suffering, not lying serenely in some painterly last pose by the riverbank. Doctors tried what they could, which in 1804 mostly meant watching and waiting as internal injuries did their work. Hamilton finally died the afternoon of July 12. The myth of instant death erases the drawn-out human cost of the duel, the extended grief, and the time everyone involved had to sit with what they'd done. The founding era loved to wrap violence in codes of honor. The slow, painful aftermath doesn't fit on a commemorative plaque. 100. The Founding Fathers finished America's story. There's a comforting fantasy that the founding generation basically wrote the last chapter of America's story at the beginning, that the Constitution and the early compromises settled the big questions once and for all, leaving only minor adjustments for later generations. The men in Philadelphia did not close the book. They left it full of loaded devices with delayed timers. Their deals over representation, federal versus state power, and most explosively slavery were not resolutions. They were postponements. The 3/5 compromise, the 20-year window before Congress could ban the international slave trade, the fugitive slave clause, the vague balancing of free and slave states in the Senate. These weren't clever solutions. They were ways of keeping the Union together by shoving the core conflict down the road. The Constitution dodged the question of whether enslaved people were persons or property in any morally satisfying way, and instead built a system where slaveholders wielded outsized political power. The founders also left huge ambiguities about executive authority, judicial review, and who counted as part of we the people. Later fights over nullification, secession, Reconstruction, civil rights, voting rights, and federal regulation all grew out of those unresolved tensions. The Civil War was not a tragic deviation from some finished founding design. It was one logical outcome of contradictions baked in from the start. The story the founders actually wrote was an opening act full of compromises they knew were unstable, trusting that future generations, people they would never meet, would grapple with the explosive questions they couldn't or wouldn't answer.